Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this new meeting to comment on the third lecture of Apocalypse and Priestly Action. And we continue with our immersion in the evolution of the mysteries as Steiner presents them to us in this cycle of lectures. We said that in the ancient mysteries, which correspond to those of Lemuria and Atlantis, but still for a long time in the first two epochs of culture after the flood, that is the Paleo-Indian and Paleo-Persian, what we call transubstantiation, that is the spiritualization of substance, took place in the physical body, and the mysteries were celebrated in the inner cavities of the earth, understood as the body of Mother Earth, the mother of the living, who in Genesis is called Eve. This transubstantiation of the physical body allowed for the stabilization of our present human bodily form with a thoroughly closed skull, of which the first complete representative, the first in which the skull completely closes, was Noah. This allowed the passage from the Atlantean era through the Great Flood with the story of Noah's Ark to the Rainbow of the Covenant once the waters receded in our post-Atlantean era. Then, at the time of the semi-ancient mysteries, that is, in the transition to the post-Atlantean era after the flood, and in particular after the Paleo-Indian epoch, transubstantiation took place in the etheric body, that is, in the vital forces of the physiology of the human body. The priest was put to the test, or rather the candidate who would become a candidate priest was put to the test when he entered the sacred place. There the ancient ferments, remember those substances that had participated in the presence of the divine forces in the mysteries, began to change the substances in the sacred crystal containers, which Steiner drew on the blackboard that you can see here, table 1, the table above. The candidate priest could see how the substances spread a solar light, that is, how this liquid substance was being solarized, penetrated by the force of the sun. More broadly, the cosmic forces, and in particular, the force of the sun. In this container in which this little sun shone, there was a monstrance, and all this formed the original monstrance, we can say. What Steiner brings us in this blackboard is precisely the image of the original monstrance that appears in the semi-ancient mysteries. So, from the ancient mysteries where the midnight sun appeared in its actual presence to the clairvoyance of the initiates, the priests of the ancient mysteries, in the darkness of the cave, of the inner cavity of the earth, here we have an image of these crystals that carry within themselves a small sun, repeating in a small scale what happened in a large scale in the ancient mysteries. So, in the semi-ancient mysteries, this sun is as if it became more contained and could be carried in these crystal containers, which together became monstrances. It was the most holy sacrament, which is the monstrance that carries a consecrated host, consecrated every Easter, and which today can only be imitated. When the candidate priest saw these rays of sunlight shining in the monstrance in this primordial most holy sacrament, when he could actually observe them, he became a priest inwardly. He was initiated, the test was passed. This image you see of this shining chalice is also the image of the human eye. The monstrance with the most holy sacrament, symbolically in today's church and in a more real sense those of the semi-ancient mysteries, the monstrance in which there is this transubstantiating element in which the solar forces enter into the substance is the image of the human eye. The incarnate eye is the stem of this monstrance, of this most holy sacrament, which opens like a cup that has been opened, we can say, through esoteric work to become like a cup. So from being closed in on itself, it has opened into a cup. And the higher eye, the solar substance, pours from the sun into this cup that has become the incarnated eye and shines within it. This is precisely the image you see. Clearly, as you understand, from this image of the most holy sacrament, of the original most holy, also derives the image of the Holy Grail, of the soul that has become a cup and welcomes the solar substance into itself. Let us now move on to the third epoch of the semi-new mysteries. We have transubstantiation, which no longer takes place in the physical element, no longer in the liquid etheric element, solid physical and liquid etheric, but in the airy astral element, therefore in the astral body. The semi-new mysteries are those proper to the transition from the second cultural epoch to the third, and characterize the third cultural epoch in particular. In this table and diagram, you can see a summary of the transitions from ancient mysteries, semi-ancient mysteries, semi-new mysteries, and finally, new mysteries. In this transition from the second epoch to the third epoch, characterizing the third, we have the semi-new mysteries with the transubstantiation of the astral body, the air element. How did this happen? Through cultic participation in the sacred word, one truly entered into communion with divine spiritual beings. In that phase, the seat of the mystery was the astral body, which is the bearer of thoughts, imaginations, and the ability to reflect the world inwardly. However, the astral body is unconscious when a person sleeps. When outside of the physical and etheric bodies, the astral body no longer perceives anything of the sensory world, but is instead permeated by entities from the spiritual worlds, from the cosmic spheres, from the supersensible worlds in general, including angelic beings who weave into the astral body the imaginations that we call dreams. Steiner shows this in the second blackboard you see, also for historical references, since there are photos of these blackboards. You see that the physical etheric body remains in bed, lying asleep, while the astral body and the eye leave the physical etheric body. In those ancient times, in the third cultural epoch, the priest worked so that man could experience this transubstantiation in the astral body. In other words, the spiritualization of the astral and of the air element. Thus, a real transformation of inner forces with a consequent living experience of the divine in the substance. Something that we will also find in the solar cult with bread and wine. Bread is the physical body, wine is the etheric body, therefore the solid element and the liquid element. The word that once consecrated, once made magical, causes the air to participate in this transubstantiation with the formulas themselves of what we call the Eucharist, which is the solar cult in the act of sacrifice, a Eucharistic sacrifice as it is called today, but it also existed before. Obviously, it had a different meaning because before Christ, the solar being was not yet inside the earth, So it was a prophecy of what was to come. Only after the coming of the Christ did this actually become real from within the substance. Before, it came from outside into substance, we can say, so from the cosmos towards earthly substance, and now it occurs from earthly substance towards the cosmos. From this you understand, for example, that in all ancient mysteries what was sacrificed on the altar were flatbreads, from which, for example, the Ligurian flatbread, among others, derives, and liquid substances such as wine, but in general fruit juices, fruit that ripened in the sun. So, as had been done, for example, to give you an image, for the wheat that had ripened in the sun and was harvested and made into flat bread, originally there was no real bread as we know it today, but rather flat breads, initially unleavened. So it was for the liquids that were extracted from fruits that had ripened in the sun. These desolarized substances had been transformed into bread and wine, into flat bread and fruit juice, and the magic word, or if you like, the consecrated word, through the air that was created by the word vibrating on those substances. The bread and the wine spiritualized, or rather, gave a prophetic image of what would be the spiritualization of the substance once the soul of spirit, the Christ, had come into being. Let us say that it was a start towards this spiritualization. It was a preparation for matter for what would then actually be spiritualization taking place from within once the mystery of Golgotha had taken place. Through this experience, the astral body became sensitive to the revelation of the apocalypse, of the images of the apocalypse. In other words, to the spiritual vision of the higher worlds. Let us always remember that the images of the apocalypse do not include the future, which is what usually interests us most, but in reality the images of the apocalypse, being in the supersensible worlds, are not bound to space-time as we understand it. So in the images of the apocalypse, there are images of the past, the future, and the present of humanity. Because in a truly spiritual consciousness, we know that we must step outside of space-time as we understand it, and therefore the past and the future are co-present in the present. Therefore, we should not link the apocalypse solely to a revelation of events that will happen in the future. This meaning exists, but it is not the main meaning. It is, we might say, a partial meaning. The fundamental meaning is that the apocalypse is the revelation of the spiritual worlds. This existed even before the mystery of Golgotha, but it was received in an unconscious form, whereas since the mystery of Golgotha it is received in a conscious form. Just as before the mystery of Golgotha, there was a prophecy of the transubstantiation of what would become the Eucharist rite of sacrifice. After the mystery of Golgotha, this Eucharistic sacrifice takes place because the Spirit of the Son, the Christ, acts from within the earth towards the cosmos with the forces of resurrection. We thus arrive at the present epoch. In the sense of the evolution of the mysteries, the present epoch means after the Christ, and in particular the epoch of the consciousness soul, which is ours, that began in 1413. So the current epoch is called the epoch of the new mysteries, in which we have finally reached the possibility of a transubstantiation that does not take place in the physical as in the ancient mysteries, not in the etheric as in the semi-ancient mysteries, not in the astral as in the semi-new mysteries. In these completely new mysteries, it takes place in the eye. This means that the process of transubstantiation and spiritualization must take place in full consciousness, in the organization of the eye. Therefore, the astral body is no longer a central place. It does participate, as do the etheric body and the physical body, in this experience of transubstantiation and sacrament, but the mystery of transubstantiation and sacrament must be consciously experienced by the core of the human I. This implies two epochal changes. The consciousness of the I, which is normally linked only to sensory impressions, must learn to experience transubstantiation as a real inner experience, and thus to perceive it inwardly through spiritualized senses, that is, free from the physical senses. It is the pure thinking that Steiner brings us as a process through his philosophy of freedom, starting from that, his first book. The I must be able, on the other hand, and this is the second change, to participate in the images of the apocalypse, that is, to recognize in ritual, in knowledge, and in supersensible perceptions, mainly images and sounds, the revelation of the cosmic Christ that becomes an inner experience. What this means, in short, is that the mystery, the participating in the mystery, shifts from a cosmic dimension, which is the rhythm of the astral body and the astral and starry worlds, to an inner dimension. The human body becomes a temple inhabited by God, or if you like, by the I, which is like a god, a sun, shining within this temple. A temple where the divine can be freely welcomed. So we have this form of temple that welcomes an inner sun, which is the I, the potentiality of a god, incipient, evolving, where the divine can be freely welcomed. The Rosicrucians expressed it in slightly different terms, saying that it is the internalization of the macrocosm in the microcosm, the internalization of the cosmos in the soul of man in full consciousness. This new priesthood, the priesthood of the new mysteries, both in the form of Cain and in the form of Abel, can only arise from this new disposition of the soul, this new inner disposition. That is, man gathers within himself real images, not covered by veils of illusion of the supersensible world in spiritual imaginations, and attains this inner priesthood. To this aim, anthroposophical spiritual science can provide us with the language and images of this new cult, because the body of knowledge of anthroposophical spiritual science helps in supporting this experience. It helps one to orient oneself in the supersensible worlds without the need to appeal to the support of sensible evidence coming from our outer senses. So there must be knowledge and experience, if we want to put it another way. This is the foundation of the new mysteries, which are no longer based on external authority, but on continuous inner verification, called discernment, in the consciousness soul, and on the conscious experience of the divine in this transubstantiation in the I. So these new mysteries can no longer be celebrated only in the external temple, but must be celebrated continuously in the temple inhabited by the soul and spirit of man. Only then does the external temple become filled with the forces of the I of the new mysteries. We can say that the temple becomes an instrument for bringing the new mysteries to experience. When man truly experiences the images of the apocalypse as an inner reality, aided in its understanding by anthroposophical spiritual science, then the apocalypse becomes alive within man. Steiner says, when I let this apocalypse act within me, it becomes one with my eye in every one of its images. We can live apocalyptically, or in other words, live in a continuous revelation of the spiritual world. This implies, as I have already mentioned several times, that the imaginations and inspirations contained in the apocalypse are no longer external visions, and therefore it is not possible to interpret what is happening today through the apocalypse in a millenarian sense. The apocalypse is not a millenarian book. It is not a book that serves to predict what will happen in the future. It is a book that speaks of the renewal of the mysteries, which are the mysteries of the present and the future. This is certainly true. However, every time we try to identify, and this has happened many, many times in history, in different ways, in different groups, in different spiritual movements, when we try to interpret the events of the apocalypse in an external, materialistic sense, as if we wanted to identify the history we're living now as identical to the events of the apocalypse, which would therefore be coming true, by doing that, we lose the opportunity of experiencing the apocalypse within ourselves because we are externalizing it. Moreover, on this basis, we can only say the first conspiracy theories were created in history, because clearly, by constantly imagining that the world would end from one day to the next, interpreting external events as the events of the apocalypse, everything, all of life, was interpreted in the light of this externalization of the apocalypse. It is true, however, that since those of the apocalypse are archetypal images, spiritual imaginations, and there are inspirational words, spiritual words, and intuitive encounters with spiritual beings are also described, so all three higher states of consciousness are represented, it is true that it is possible to recognize the archetypal matrix of events in the images, words, and beings that are described in the apocalypse. This is true. So it is possible to read in the events of every age, the past, the present, and the future, references to what is indicated in the apocalypse. Imaginations, inspirations, and intuitions. In the sense of this priesthood of the new mysteries, the apocalypse speaks of the inner evolution of the human eye, which moves towards an increasing spiritual eye, toward the union with the spiritual eye, but also of those who will renounce this union and become followers of the beast, of whom Steiner will speak in subsequent lectures. These imaginations of the apocalypse become evolutionary forces in the inner work that the human soul must do, and a prelude to the mystery of this inner sun lighting up, of the union of the incarnated eye with the higher eye, or, if you like, in other words, of the rising Christ in the heart of man. The not I, but Christ in me. In the semi-new mysteries of transubstantiation, the dimension of the mystery was the astral body. The type of consciousness was dreamlike, so everything passed through a dream, and the experience of transubstantiation took place through ritual and the sacred word. Thus, access to the apocalypse was cosmic, it was external, because the astral body lives in the dimension of cosmic distances and because Christ Jesus was yet to come. Since the mystery of Golgotha, since the coming of Christ Jesus, the place, the dimension of the mystery is the eye, the organization of the eye, and therefore it is possible to arrive at these mysteries in full waking consciousness. The experience of transubstantiation takes place through knowledge and meditation, and the apocalypse becomes a continuous inner experience. When Christ says of himself in the apocalypse, "I am the Alpha and the Omega," this sentence of the mysteries does not allude only to the beginning and the end of it in a temporal sense, to reiterate what I was saying before, but to the beginning and the fulfillment of cosmic evolution, of the unfolding of the Word from the prologue of the Gospel of John to the end of the Apocalypse. In the beginning was the Logos. In the beginning was the Word. We can also see how the Alpha and the Omega are present in the series of major arcana of the Tarot. In fact, in the first and last major arcana of the Tarot, we have Alpha and Omega. We have seen this with those who have studied the Tarot in depth, but this is just to give you a reference. Alpha is found in the magician. It is the position that the magician assumes, and Omega is found in the world, in the garland around the woman of the world, Sophia. And the Tarot, in fact, is called in the Egyptian sense the Book of Thoth or Book of Life, as it is called in the Apocalypse. And Steiner, when he speaks of the archetypal origin of the images, the symbols that currently adorn what we call the Christmas tree, places the Tau Rho, which is the symbol of the Tarot, Tau and Rho, to Greek letters, at the center of the symbols of the Christmas tree, as you can see here in this image. Just above Mercury and Mars, halfway through the horizontal arm, which is Alpha and Omega. This means that between the magician and the world lies the whole book of life, and the latter is the unfolding of the symbols themselves on the Christmas tree, which represent the macrocosmic and microcosmic evolution. So when Christ says, "I am the Alpha and the Omega," he means that within this interval between the Alpha and the Omega lies all cosmic, terrestrial, and human evolution. The original sounds, which we call the letters of the alphabet, are therefore not arbitrary symbols. For the ancient initiates, they never were and could not be, rather, they were perceived as living beings of creative powers. The sound A, which is Alpha in Greek and Aleph in Hebrew, is therefore a spiritual entity, an essence of the primordial word that sprang from the divine, and the same applies to all the other letters. In the ancient mysteries, pronouncing a sound meant collaborating with the spiritual being and not simply articulating a linguistic sign, as we would say. When humanity began to number sounds and transform them into signs, reducing them to dead signs, it performed an act of secularization of language. That is, it made it more abstract. This clearly allowed it to be communicated intellectually, but at the same time this process of intellectual communication of language through the written alphabet, through writing, caused the original power of sounds, of letters as beings, to be progressively lost. Thus, the Logos, the living word, became a code, and with it, something of the original magical power of the word was lost. In all ancient cultures, traditional cultures, many of which acquired a written language only much later, having always a spoken language only, when faced with the written word, we are talking about peoples all over the world, We can talk about the peoples of Africa. We can talk about the Native American peoples. We can talk about the peoples of Asia or the Aborigines. When they look at the signs of letters that could be translated into sounds when read, they pointed to this codified language as demonic work. This was because in a type of consciousness still united with what was being experienced, even if in an unconscious form, as in all ancient and traditional populations who still have a deep perception of the divinity of the cosmos, they knew very well that this would mean the death of the words themselves, the death of the spiritual perception of the being of letters, of what we call letters, of the sounds that are in fact linked to letters. It is as if the written word were a spell cast on the various sounds of the logos, language therefore, which was born as the echo of divine word of the logos, has become an abstract system, like a body without a soul, and we have to live with this. What we must do is start from the event of the spell casting on the sounds of the logos and bring them back to life. In Masonic and Rosicrucian circles, there is talk of the lost word. This would be the lost word being found again. And Steiner will talk more about it. So what is the Alpha? It is the beginning of cosmic evolution. It is ancient Saturn. And to understand the profound meaning of the Alpha, we must go back to ancient Saturn, which is the first stage of cosmic evolution. There, as you may already know, the germ of the physical body of man is born. Man is a being who, at that time, consisted only of different intensities of heat, of the ether of heat, still lacking a differentiated physical body, but already carrying the potential of all future humanity. Man is a seed, an egg, of all future humanity. On ancient Saturn, there are no gaseous, liquid or solid forms or substances, only heat or warmth. There are differences in heat, differences in spiritual vibration, which are the first manifestations of the cosmic word, the logos. Every difference in heat between hot and cold, so to speak, is at that time a sound of the divine language. Creation, therefore, is the speaking of the Logos. The Logos speaks creation into being, pronounces it. The Alpha, therefore, is a primordial sound of heat, the first cosmic vowel pronounced by the Christ still hidden in the being of the Father. It therefore resonates in this Saturnian fire and lays the foundation, the seed, of the human physical body as the future instrument of the Word in which the Word would be incarnated, namely Christ, the Logos and Jesus of Nazareth. And the same applies on a small scale to all human beings. Then, in the transition from ancient Saturn to ancient Sun, ancient Moon, ancient Earth, and current Earth, man becomes progressively more inward, internalizing the cosmos. On the Sun, the element of air is added, bringing breath, and man begins to reflect the cosmic rhythm inwardly, initiating a first inner image. On the Moon, the forces of liquids, of water, also enter, and the inner life deepens further. On Earth, the solid element is added, and a reflected consciousness is born that separates itself from the cosmos, acquiring the task to then recognize it inwardly in full consciousness. This journey from ancient Saturn, Sun, Moon to present Earth is in fact the path of incarnation of the word itself, of the Logos. What was divine fire gradually becomes a word that is thought, felt, and then spoken. Every organ of the human body is the result of a cosmic sound of the Logos become solidified. The eye, the ear, the liver, the heart, all the examples you can give are words that were spoken by the Logos, which finally incarnated in Christ. We can say that they are incarnated words of the Logos. The organs are incarnated words of the Logos, and the Logos itself will incarnate when this whole evolutionary process is ready to host it in Jesus of Nazareth. Man is therefore literally a living text written by God, a gospel of organs as words, composed of processes that are the sounds of letters. Just as there is a macrocosmic gospel, which is the cosmic evolution from Saturn to Vulcan, passing through Earth, there is a microcosmic gospel, which is the human being itself. Because gospel means, in fact, tidings, news. It means the word that has been spoken, and that each time has brought about an advancement in evolution. Man is therefore the Alpha and Omega of the world. And when Christ says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, he speaks as the Word, the Logos that creates and gathers his own creations. He creates his creatures and then goes to dwell among the creatures. In the Alpha, Christ is the force that shapes the world, the principle of Saturn's heat, and in the beginning was the Logos of the Gospel of John. In the Omega, Christ is the fulfillment, the man who carries within himself the entire macrocosm, transfigured, completely spiritualized. The Alpha, then, is the God who creates man as a creature from the forces of the macrocosm. The Omega is the man who gives back the whole macrocosm permeated by the consciousness of the I. From the I back to God, all substance has been redeemed. It has been permeated by the consciousness of the I. This is the fundamental point of the new mysteries. This is why when Earth is dissolved from a material point of view and man enters the state of future Jupiter, then Venus, and then Vulcan, it will carry within itself the entire spiritualized macrocosm, thus becoming himself a fulfilled Logos. The Christ says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, which in the beginning is outside of cosmic evolution, but in the end is within man itself as I am. So Christ is outside man and the cosmos is in the beginning. At the baptism in the Jordan through the mystery of Golgotha, he is incarnated in Jesus of Nazareth, who gives this experience of becoming I am to all humanity. From that moment in the new mysteries, it is possible to reach future Vulcan, when all humanity will perceive inwardly that they are I am, not I, but Christ in me. The Apocalypse, therefore, is not a book of external prophecies, as Steiner further emphasizes, but a vision of what happens to humanity when the cosmic word is internalized. In other words, the Apocalypse is the revelation of the Word in man, the reawakening of the Spirit Word within the human being. The images of the Apocalypse are therefore primordial sounds. We can see the images and the words, the sounds of Alpha, of ancient Saturn, resounding once more in the human soul, but now in a progressively more conscious form, thanks to this union with the Christ. When man, through the spiritual science of Antroposofia, learns to recognize in the phenomena of the world of its own body, its own microcosm, the letters of the Logos, man discovers the divine language. Then the Apocalypse opens up not as a book, but as a living experience of one's own I becoming divine, becoming a creator. Therefore, the Alpha, the A or Aleph, Alpha in Greek, Aleph in Hebrew, is the primordial sound of cosmic heat, the principle of the word in its origin on ancient Saturn. Human language is a fallen fragment, we might say, a decayed fragment of the divine language that must be re-spiritualized, brought back to the divine spiritual world. The Christ is the principle that unites the beginning and the end, the cosmic word that becomes man, and the Apocalypse is the revelation of the Logos of the Christ, who, from Alpha in the macrocosm, becomes full consciousness, passing through the microcosm, finally reaching fulfillment in the Omega. Omega, therefore, is the fulfillment of the word in the completely redeemed man, he who has brought the consciousness of the I within himself to unite with the Christ. It is the bearer of a cosmos, a macrocosm, completely internalized. So everything we perceive in creation are words. We can think of it this way. They are sounds of the divine language of the Logos, which have crystallized both what is outside of us and what is within our body. And so our task through the I is to reawaken this spirit word everywhere, the lost word that can be found again. As we said at the beginning of the evolution of ancient Saturn, man had no form or organs. He was a being of pure heat, a living entity in this fire, in this substance of spiritual fire. A man perceived itself between heat and cold, between hot and cold, that is, where it was warmer or less warm, so to speak, and was in fact a germ barely distinct from the cosmos. It was still very much united with the whole cosmos, indeed completely united with the whole cosmos, beginning to perceive something of itself in the difference between hot and cold. Then, from this original mass of heat, secondary masses of heat differentiated themselves, with differences between a warmer interior and a colder exterior. Finally, a sort of skin of heat formed, a covering that separated it from the outside. This skin of heat was the first revelation of the world to man, the boundary where man began to perceive that there was an outside distinct from its own inside. This is also what happens in the very early years of life, particularly with the warmth of a mother's embrace, but in general of the family, which creates this mantle of warmth that allows us to perceive that there is, on the other hand, unity, but on the other, also a distinction between what is inside in the warmth and what is outside in less warmth, or, if we want to exaggerate, in the cold. So with the embrace of the mother, the embrace of the parents, of the family, the child, who does not yet distinguish its perception of the objects of the outside world from that of itself, the child perceives for the first time that there is an outside distinct from an inside. In the language of mysteries, this is the first perception of beta in Greek, beth in Hebrew, which means house, the house of man, whereas the very being of the womb, this original beginning, is pure self-consciousness that is being born. It is alpha. So alpha, beta. Alpha, beta means the principle of consciousness, this germ of original warmth, alpha, and the shell of warmth, the skin of warmth that is formed, which distinguishes interiority and exteriority, beta, the house. It is what I was saying before, the primordial temple of man, this house of consciousness, beta or Beth, and on the other hand the spirit that dwells within it, and then also the soul that develops within, the principle of consciousness that dwells within the house, within the temple. The divine house of man is the temple, and inside there is this primordial consciousness, Alpha. Alpha is the primordial consciousness. Beta is the temple where it is located, the skin of warmth that distinguishes between inside and outside. So why do we call it the alphabet? Because alpha and beta are the first sounds of the world. The inside alpha and the outside beta, or rather, the boundary between inside and outside, beta. So A, alpha, aleph, the man of heat. Steiner calls it living wonder. It is man who for the first time feels itself to exist as a flame that perceives itself. In Greek, wonder is tauma, from which the word thaumaturge also derives, meaning wonder worker. Wonder is the heat itself, the very substance of heat, the original cosmic feeling of being. It is the beginning of the I am. B, beta, Beth is the house, the container, the temple, the skin of heat that receives and separates from the world. This is the first act of the world that is reflected in man. It is the formation of a boundary, which we call the house, the temple. Beta is therefore the image of the cosmic mother, of the receptacle that welcomes this primordial warmth of the I am. In Alpha, man discovers himself as divine fire, and in Beta, the world offers him a dwelling place, a temple. From Alpha to Beta, the relationship between I and world, man and cosmos, child and mother is born. By extension, Steiner gives this example of Alpha, Beta, and then Omega, but in reality, we should include the entire alphabet between Alpha and Omega, because the alphabet, understood as sounds, that is, spiritual beings that have been spoken into being by the Logos, by the Word, is the cosmic path of evolution. So, continuing from Alpha to Omega, passing through the entire alphabet, we travel through cosmic evolution. Each sound represents a step in the growing union between man and cosmos. So, in short, A, Alpha, is the man of heat. It is wonder, called tauma in Greek. It is the primordial I am, and corresponds to the beginning of ancient Saturn. B, Beta, is the house, the temple, the skin, the boundary of the world, and begins from the beginning of ancient Sun. Then the subsequent letters, we must imagine them like the progressive internalization of the worlds: air, water, earth, soul, and spirit. The entire evolution that goes from Saturn, Sun, Moon, Earth, until Vulcan. And Omega is the fulfillment of the entire evolution. It is the end of future Vulcan, the man who contains the entire world within itself, the accomplished word. We can say that this whole great narrative that the Logos has made, which we call creation, has made the favorite creature, man, a creator, and so it is complete. The narrative is complete from Alpha to Omega. When the creation of future Vulcan reaches its completion, Omega, man will have internalized all the sounds as divine forces of the alphabet, which at first spoke to him from outside, from the macrocosm. Then he too will be able to say in all truthfulness, I am the Alpha and the Omega, just as Christ already is. And he already says so. Man, having become the conscious bearer of the Logos, will himself be the Word that created the world. The Christ, who is the solo Logos, the Word, the being who incarnated in Jesus and in the mystery of Golgotha, is at the center of evolution, halfway between Alpha and Omega, that is the center of the cosmic alphabet. We have also seen this in the image of the Christmas tree, and if you look, you can see that this cross is formed. And among other things, the tarot, which is the symbol of the tarot, placed at the center of the symbols of the Christmas tree. In the tarot, you'll find that it corresponds to the hanged man, the wheel of fortune on one side and the hanged man on the other. The arcana placed at the center of the entire sequence of the major arcana. So the wheel of fortune, which is the tarot, the fourth, which means Sophia, and the hanged man, who is the one who sacrifices himself, the Christ who is sacrificed. The mystery of Golgotha, as we always find it in the tarot in this sense, is the midpoint of the narrative of the Logos, of this cosmic language. Man at the beginning is the germ that says A. It perceives itself in the amazement, in the wonder of warmth and heat. And in the end, on Vulcan, it will pronounce Omega, O, the fully spiritualized inner world. This can also be experienced in eurythmy. The A of the opening to wonder, the A of Venus, then the O of Jupiter, which instead creates a circle while the whole world comes into being. So first it opens up to the macrocosm and then creates a cosmos within the substances that have been spiritualized by the I. In the O, the inner world is fully spiritualized, and in the middle is the Christ, the incarnate Logos, who, as a letter, here it is not mentioned, is the letter I, the one who passes through the whole sequence of sounds and redeems them, restoring their divine nature. With these three letters, A, O, I, the occult name of Christ is formed, which was already known in the ancient mysteries, which is IAO, which is I am Alpha, Omega. So we also find it in the Apocalypse itself. What man will become at the end of Vulcan's evolution, Christ already is now. IAO. I am the Alpha and the Omega. And this is the profound mystery of the phrase in the prologue of the Gospel of John that is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh. And of its apocalyptic echo, I am the Alpha and the Omega. As we said, in ancient times, humans knew that every sound was a spiritual being, and therefore, in the mysteries, sacred intonation, singing, and the vibrating word were not decoration, not something extra, but a magical creative act. And this, Steiner says, is also fundamental in the new mysteries, both in the new mysteries of Cain, which we call the service of mystery, and in the Christian community, which is the new mysteries of Abel. To pronounce the letters was to participate in creation, to intone the cosmic word itself. When language, as we said before, became a mere convention and became abstract, the alphabet transformed into signs that could be written down, man gradually lost communion with this living word. Then the lost word was born inwardly as a human experience. The lost word referred to by the Kenites' esoteric currents, the esoteric orders, Rosicrucians and Freemasonry, is therefore this: the ability to hear and pronounce sounds as living beings of the spiritual world, and thus to recognize them in their being agents in creation, both in nature and in the cosmos, as well as in the being of man, in his body. As we said before, these words form the organs of the human being. They form animal species and plant species, mineral species. Rediscovering the lost and rediscovered word means that I can see beyond the veils of the illusion of the sense physical and see the spiritual processes that originally generated those creatures. The word that was spoken by the Logos to bring that being into existence in creation and then in its evolution as well. The lost word is then the language of the ancient mysteries before writing and the abstraction of language were established. The rediscovered word is the mystery of the language that lives in the initiate. It is the initiate who has completely restored dignity to the word, as he perceives that within it are spiritual beings capable of bringing into being forms of creation. Therefore, I am the Alpha and the Omega is the ultimate formula of the mysteries that fully expresses cosmic, terrestrial, and human evolution. It is the description of the entire evolutionary process of the word in the cosmos, and therefore also includes the evolution of man. We have said that the Alpha is man still immersed in the divine, experiencing this primordial wonder, this primordial amazement. The Omega is man who has made the world divine within himself, and Christ is the bridge that lives between the two. The word that is given to humanity in Christ's sacrifice restores the possibility for man to reconnect spiritually with the entire macrocosm, to return to experience the creation of the macrocosm as divine, spiritual, and also himself. Steiner says that the Apocalypse itself is a compendium of spiritual images, spiritual words, descriptions of encounters with spiritual beings, which was an experience of the ancient mysteries, now reborn in the new mysteries, fully conscious, whereas the ancient mysteries were experienced in a dreamlike form. The Apocalypse is therefore written in the language of mysteries, the language in which every sound, every image, every being that is described, every name, is the direct manifestation of a divine or cosmic force. Humanity, in a time in which it has lost this ability to perceive sound as a spiritual being, this living word, and has reduced it to a dead sign or a number, an abstract sign, a mere linguistic convention, can now, through the Apocalypse, regain this life of the word, this living word, the rediscovered word, a word that returns to being creative. So when in the Apocalypse you read, I am the Alpha and the Omega, it is not symbolic or poetic language, but cosmic language. Alpha and Omega are states of man from the beginning to the end of cosmic evolution. Just as man experienced the fall into materiality, so too did sounds experience the same cosmic drama of man's fall. Just as they were beings, perceived as beings, and each sound had its own quality, even the ability to shape creation, now they have fallen. With the emergence of intellectuality, we no longer perceive these beings, we consider them abstract signs. They have left behind empty forms. So in modern sounds, says Steiner, it is no longer the gods who live, but Ahrimanic entities, powers that imprison the spiritual life of the word within the pure mechanism of an abstract language. Steiner says that this explains, as I mentioned before, how in traditional folklore cultures, written language is considered a black magic spell, precisely because it was the moment when the decline in the perception of these spiritual beings of sound was sealed. Writing fixes, immobilizes, and in this immobilization kills the spirit of the living sound. The good news is that starting from this, we must give it life again, and only the I can do this. Only an I that has united with the Logos, with Christ. Ancient liturgical language, such as sacred languages, for example, Egyptian, Hebrew, Vedic, still preserves today the echo of the ancient creative power of the word. So if you want to have an appreciation of what the dimension was in which the initiates of antiquity lived in perceiving these beings of sound, you will find it in the Vedas, in the Vedic language, in the Hebrew, and in Egyptian hieroglyphs. On the other hand, you must imagine that this speaking the creation into being that the Logos does can also be imagined as a song, because in this narrative, just like in a song, the hierarchies participated that often, as we can see in some representations, for example, frescoes and paintings, are represented as the celestial orchestra, as the celestial musicians. You have to imagine that this narrative is sung. The Logos sings the words that bring creation into being, and the spiritual hierarchies with their celestial motions that govern the celestial spheres, angels, archangels, the entire second and first hierarchies play for the Logos. And this song of creation is generated, a true cosmic creative act. For this reason, all the ancient initiates had knowledge of singing and of the rules of music. Think, for example, of Orpheus lyre, the 7-stringed lyre. These 7 strings resonate with the 7 celestial spheres, and so he sang and enchanted, in a sense, even these ferocious beasts as an image, clearly a reference to the animal nature of man, which he was able to bring to a new level of evolution. Also, for example, the minstrels, many of whom wore cathars, we are talking about the Middle Ages, they too learned to play and sing, and thus created worlds with this, we might say, small replica of the original song of creation. Tolkien himself, when he describes the creation of the world in the Silmarillion, which we then find in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion is a sort of Akashic record of the world of the Lord of the Rings. Creation is sung into being. At the beginning of the Apocalypse, let's always remember that Apocalypse means revelation, John declares that he had an inner revelation. He says, a revelation of Jesus Christ that God gave me to show his servant the things that must happen shortly. Things that must happen shortly in an evolutionary sense. That's always to keep in mind. When the Christ says, I'm coming soon, it means that every time we change our inner self, our thinking, feeling, and willing, we can unite with the Christ. So it will happen soon. Does not mean it will happen in X years. It means every time we approach Christ by evolving inwardly. Steiner says that this revelation of Jesus Christ that John speaks of is true in two simultaneous aspects. The Christ is an image, therefore an imaginative experience of Christ appearing. It is the risen Christ or etheric Christ, and the Christ appearing as word, resounding as a word, which is instead an inspirational experience. That is, the divine voice that is able to describe the vision, to describe the imagination. John, as a highly elevated initiate, is able to both see and hear, that is, he has acquired both imagination and inspiration, both the ability to see spiritual images and the ability to hear the spiritual word. The Apocalypse is a testimony to John's dual perception of the supersensible, what he saw, which is imagination, and what he heard, inspiration, image and word. And he bears witness to this, that is, he makes the reader, humanity, a partaker of the reality of the risen Christ, the etheric Christ, who is a cosmic Christ. The Christ incarnated in the body of Jesus of Nazareth and then incarnated in the earth with the mystery of Golgotha is found precisely at the midpoint of this evolution, as we have said, between ancient Saturn and future Vulcan, precisely in the middle of earthly evolution. What man will become only at the end of Vulcan, Christ already is now. Consequently, Christ is, we might say, the one who shows us how man was in the beginning, even though he had no consciousness, the original cosmic Adam, and how man will ultimately be in the future, uniting with him, uniting with it. Christ is the cosmic principle from which humanity arose and the fulfillment toward which we are evolving. The being of Christ, therefore, is a transfigured time. What is future for us is present for him. Time, therefore, as I mentioned before, is to be considered contemporaneity for supersensible vision. When we are, like John, who sees a spiritual image and hears a spiritual word in a supersensible spiritual perception, we perceive the past, present, and future simultaneously. Ancient Saturn, ancient Sun, ancient Moon, present Earth in its two halves, Mars and Mercury, future Jupiter, future Venus, and future Vulcan, the totality of becoming. And the mission of modern man, in particular that of the priest of the new mysteries, the initiate of the new mysteries, is to restore concreteness, life, a spiritual life to all sacred scriptures, to all the sacred texts of humanity. Here we're talking about the Apocalypse, but this, in a broader sense, applies to all sacred scriptures. This is what Steiner himself tried to do continuously throughout his career as a lecturer, when he commented, for example, on the Gospels, laying the foundations for anthroposophical Christology. It is no longer a question of interpreting in a literal or moral sense, but of reconnecting the sacred scriptures to the original language of the mysteries, this language where words and sounds are living beings. Only in this way can the word become alive again, no longer an Aramaic sound, but a real, living, spiritual current that unites one human being to another and together unites human to nature and the cosmos. These possibilities are what task in the new mysteries. The modern human soul which has lost the ability to vibrate with the life of the beings of sound, in ancient times made every word a spiritual experience, a small world in itself. So much so that when we commented on Genesis, and in the commentary that Steiner makes on Genesis, the first thing we said, if you remember, those of you who participated, was that every word could be translated into a sentence, if not more. So, in the end, a few words gave rise to very broad descriptions. This is because language, in that case Hebrew, but this also applies, as we said, to Vedic, it also applies to Egyptian, is a living organism. More specifically, it is the etheric body of the archangels which, being displaced in space, having partly detached from it, having transferred it into space, permeates the atmosphere of the places where the same language is spoken. So the archangel of the Vedic, the archangel of the Hebrew, the archangel of the Egyptian, we have already mentioned the archangel of the Hebrews, who was Michael, when he was the spirit of the Hebrew people. The archangel of the Egyptian language is another one we have mentioned, Raphael, also called Tot, who later in evolution became the archangel of the Italian language. This ancient perception was at the root of the fact that language was continuously perceived as alive, up to the Greek world. In the Greek world, the word was still alive. It was a being that breathed in the soul space between the speaker and the listener. But after that time, we find its last traces in Latin words, especially those used in sacred context, a complete externalization begins. Words no longer move human beings inwardly. They no longer stir their conscience. And this is a fundamental concept in order to understand that we need a Sophia of language, a wisdom of language that Steiner would call, in a book he was going to write but never completed, Logosophia, that is, the wisdom of the Logos. Better yet, the consciousness of the word, giving consciousness back to words. The word, as we have said, if we want to form a complete spiritual image of it, was even a song. The word was brought into being in the rhythm of the cosmos, in the music of the spheres. Today, it is considered a conventional dead sign, an abstraction, a tool we can use to learn a language. But in the future, it will have to return to becoming a creative force, a spirit word that has been lost and rediscovered, and thus resurrected to new life. When John contemplates the revelation, the appearance of Jesus Christ, his is not a mystical vision as we might understand it today, but a cosmic event in which the Word, the Logos, manifests itself simultaneously as sound, as light or image, and as an encounter with a being. And Steiner writes, "It is as if the entire element of the clouds concentrated and took on a human and angelic form." When in the sacred scriptures you find references to clouds, for example, or to the heavens, the kingdom of heaven, the risen Christ is perceived as ascending to what we call the heavens. Paul says, "I saw him among the clouds." A cloud is not a meteorological element in the strict sense. A cloud is the etheric substance of the world. It is the luminous matrix that takes shape when the divine spirit manifests itself. It is the etheric world, and Joan at that moment is no longer just a subject observing an object, but he himself, in this experience of images, sounds, and encounters with spiritual beings, becomes one with the object of his observation. Subject and object coincide. At that moment, silence falls. In the silence, he receives the divine word. So, in the union of subject and object, he encounters spiritual beings in image, and in silence, the word. The letter with the 7 seals mentioned in the Apocalypse is also an inner reality. When in man, we can say when Joan becomes silence, when he becomes one with this completely receptive inner state. When man's personal word is silent, then he can receive the divine letter. It is a sealed revelation. It is the cosmic scripture that contains the mysteries of the cosmos. The letter, says Steiner, is the cosmic logos that was sent to man, and the 7 seals that seal it are the 7 forces that close but also protect the mystery. These 7 are the 7 planetary metamorphoses of the Holy Week from Saturn to Vulcan. They are also 7 states of consciousness, life and form. To unseal, to remove the seal, to break the seal, means to internalize, to awaken within oneself one's 7 spiritual centers, the seals of the soul, what we call lotus flowers or chakras, so that the letter can be read from within and no longer from without. When Joan in the Apocalypse receives this letter, the 7 seals, and decides to open it, he represents the turning point of humanity. Man begins to consciously participate in divine revelation, becoming a witness and instrument of the word. It is written, "Blessed is he who reads and listens." This is not a moral admonition, but it is a sentence, an initiatory formula. We have seen that reading and listening means reading with the imaginative consciousness, that is, perceiving the spiritual images that are present in the text of the Apocalypse, of the letter. Listening with inspirational consciousness, that is, hearing the cosmic word that vibrates beyond the dead letter. Only those who read and listen, only those who unite imagination and inspiration become blessed, because they become part of the word itself, they encounter it as a being. And when man understands the Apocalypse in this way, he recognizes that the time has come. This is the sentence that is given, the time when the word must rise again as a creative force within the soul. The fact that Steiner speaks of the new mysteries in connection with the Apocalypse and the founding of the Christian community therefore has a karmic meaning. The request made to him by the founders of the Christian community, by Friedrich Rittermeyer, is clearly a karmic event, because it is the first time that a current of Abel consciously agrees to welcome an element of Cain. So a lunar Abelite current welcomes a solar Cainite element, and to allow the very union of the mysteries of Abel with those of Cain, of the lunar mysteries with the solar ones, so that we can finally reach, in successive incarnations of those same communities that experience this union, the union with the solar mysteries of Cain. So, Steiner says, it is not mere arbitrariness. It is in the karma of the community for religious renewal, in the Christian community, that we now need to talk about the Apocalypse, because Joan, author of the Apocalypse, author of the Gospel of Joan, is Cain reincarnated. So it is Abel who asks Cain to help him find the divine that he has lost. Lost in image, lost in word, lost in encounter, and now he can finally find it again. Where do we find again the encounter with the divine that the Abbolite current has lost in image, word, and being? In the Gospels, it is clearly described. All the organized religions of the time, both Judaism and paganism, oppose in various ways the action of Christ Jesus because they cannot recognize him. Only those who have been marginalized by the dominant religions, which are Abbolite religions, completely priestly, lunar, begin to awaken to a solar consciousness, to be able to begin to recognize the Christ incarnate in Jesus. So it is a spiritual necessity of our time that man learns again to read the sacred texts as living realities in image, word, and in the encounter with being, if we want to move from the mysteries of the astral body, this third phase of metamorphosis of the mysteries, the so-called semi-new mysteries of the third cultural epoch, to those of the eye, which are the new mysteries that are only possible after the action of the Christ. We conclude, the service of Mizraim in the sense of Cain and the Christian community in the sense of Abel must become communities in which the apocalypse is lived again and not only studied. In summary, the living language, this language that must come back to life, is in fact the possibility of recognizing that the macrocosm, everything that exists in creation, has been brought into being through the word of the Logos, which narrated and sang creation into being. John, with his vision of the apocalypse, unites himself completely with the risen Christ, with the etheric Christ. He has become the pure receptacle of the word, and thus he receives the letter with the 7 seals. What does this mean? It means that these seals are broken, and the Logos that is enclosed in these 7 centers of the human being, in these 7 states of consciousness of the human being, is finally internalized. Unsealing, breaking the seals, means awakening the powers of imagination and inspiration within. Thus, those who read and listen become blessed. Blessed are those who see imaginatively and listen inspiratively. Those who experience the word as a living revelation and not as a dead concept. And so, you remember that he said that this revelation, this apocalypse, will happen soon. John declares, and so the time has come. Therefore, the modern epoch of the consciousness soul is called to renew language as a path to spiritual resurrection, which are the new mysteries. With this, we come to the end of this 3rd lecture, and I thank you all for listening. Thank you all, and see you soon for the 4th part. Thank you, Giorgio. Bye, thank you, bye.